It wasn't supposed to happen. Not this late in the war. Not this far down the road. But on the muddy banks of Gloucester Point, Virginia, in the dying breath of 1781, the British weren't finished. Not yet. While Cornwallis waded across the York River, trapped and running out of time, the most critical cavalry engagement of the American Revolution erupted just a short ride away. A brutal, thundering collision between the redcoats and the rebels, men who fought like they had nothing left to lose. It would be called the Battle of the Hook, and it wasn't just another skirmish. It was the last gasp of British dominance on American soil. Somewhere in the chaos rode John Graves Simcoe, the cunning loyalist with a reputation for unrelenting aggression. Opposing him, Marquis de Choisy, the bold French general with orders to cut off all escape routes. And by his side, American and French cavalrymen fighting not just to win, but to trap Cornwallis once and for all. This was more than a battle. It was the door slamming shut. And if it failed, the entire Yorktown campaign could have collapsed. This is the forgotten cavalry fight that locked the British in and helped end the war. A story buried in time, but soaked in thunder, sabers, and grit. The Battle of the Hook. One final charge before the Empire fell. October 3rd, 1781. The tide was turning in America's favor, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. Across the York River, the British General Charles Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown. Washington and Rochambeau's combined forces were tightening the noose. But Cornwallis still had a sliver of hope. A northern escape route through Gloucester Point. And standing guard over that exit was John Graves Simcoe, commander of the Queen's Rangers. Simcoe was no ordinary soldier. Sharp, quick-witted, and dangerous. He had made his name with bold raids and lightning-fast movements. He knew the terrain. He knew the risks. And he knew that if Gloucester Point fell, so would the last lifeline of the British Army. The American forces on the Gloucester side were under Marquis de Choisy, the experienced French officer given command of the Allied detachment. His mission was crystal clear. Cut off Cornwallis. No room for error. No room for mercy. Simcoe wasn't waiting to be surrounded. He had cavalry. He had loyalist infantry. He wanted to strike first, shock the enemy, scatter their plans, and punch a hole through the tightening siege. He chose aggression. And with that, the Battle of the Hook began. It wasn't a clash of armies. It was a storm. Simcoe unleashed his cavalry like a hammer, aiming to break the enemy lines before they could even breathe. Dust exploded under hoofbeats. French dragoons drew sabers. American cavalry units surged to meet them head-on. It was violent, loud, unforgiving. The clash between mounted troops turned Gloucester Point into a chaos field of galloping hooves and shouts in multiple languages. American and French cavalry fought side by side, not just to hold the line, but to dominate it. Among them rode the fierce Lauzun's Legion, commanded by the eccentric and flamboyant Duc de Lauzun, whose bright uniform and reputation for reckless bravery were hard to miss. He wasn't just show, he led from the front. Lauzun's Legion tore into Simcoe's cavalry like wolves. Blades clanged, horses reared, and riders crashed into the dust. It was hand-to-hand and brutal. One wrong move meant being trampled. Simcoe tried to regroup, but Lauzun had seized the initiative. The French cavalry didn't hesitate. They pushed, pressed, and carved a path forward. But Simcoe wasn't out yet. His Queen's Rangers, battle-hardened, skilled, and loyal, formed a defensive arc. Every retreat was calculated. Every fallback designed to slow the French advance just enough. But the problem wasn't the foot soldiers. It was the overwhelming pressure. Choisy's infantry began arriving. More French troops, more Americans. Simcoe was suddenly looking at an enemy twice his size, fighting with purpose, cutting off his retreat. He could see it now. If he didn't disengage, the Queen's Rangers would be slaughtered or captured. He gave the order. Simcoe began pulling his forces back toward the British defensive lines across Gloucester Point, holding formation like a coiled snake. His cavalry shielded the withdrawal, harassing any attempt to pursue. The Americans had held the field. Gloucester Point was in Allied hands. The battle was short, but it was decisive. It slammed the northern door shut on Cornwallis. The trap was now complete, and the next act would unfold at Yorktown. As Simcoe's battered forces retreated, the battlefield at Gloucester Point settled into silence, broken only by the sounds of wounded horses, groaning men, and distant musket fire echoing from across the York River. The French and American troops took a breath, but they knew it wasn't over. They had secured the point, yes, but their victory now served a much larger purpose. Across the river, General George Washington's siege of Yorktown was grinding forward. The Battle of the Hook hadn't just sealed off Cornwallis's last hope for escape. It was a message, a thunderclap that told the world the British no longer held the initiative. Not on land, not at sea, and certainly not in Virginia. General Thomas Nelson, a Virginia native and key commander under Washington, watched the French and American flags rise over Gloucester Point with a grim satisfaction. He understood the value of ground, how a seemingly minor battle could choke off an army's final breath. By the time Cornwallis received word that Simcoe had failed to break out, it was too late to adjust his plans. Reinforcements were not coming. Every route, land or sea, was sealed. Inside Yorktown's trenches, Washington and French General Rochambeau were tightening the noose. Artillery bombardments pounded British positions day and night. The sky turned black with smoke. Cannonballs shattered walls and morale alike. The redcoats, once confident and dominant, were shrinking behind dirtworks and desperation. And Cornwallis? He stopped attending meetings. His health was failing. But worse than illness was clarity. He knew. Gloucester Point had been the last gamble, and it failed. The Battle of the Hook wasn't just another skirmish. It was the sound of the cage door locking shut. A strange silence fell over Yorktown in the days following the Battle of the Hook. Not peace, not victory, just inevitability. General George Washington stood beside the Comte de Lauzun, gazing through a spyglass from a ridge outside Yorktown. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The smoke rising from Gloucester Point told them what they needed to know. Simcoe had failed. The British flanking route was gone. The enemy was trapped. From that moment forward, the American and French artillery fired relentlessly on. French engineers built siege trenches with cold efficiency, inching closer every hour. At night, the glow of exploding shells lit the sky like a grim fireworks display. Inside Yorktown, British soldiers huddled in the mud, cut off and slowly crumbling. Cornwallis sent out a desperate plea: reinforcements, negotiation, anything. But the world wasn't listening. It wasn't just the Americans who had turned the tide, it was a coalition. At Gloucester Point, French cavalrymen, foreigners just months ago, had fought like they were defending their homeland. At Yorktown, German Hessians, hired by the British, began questioning what they were dying for. The battlefield had become more than a clash of armies. It had become a crucible. And in that crucible, something was being forged, something that looked a lot like independence. Then, on October 17th, 1781, it came. A white flag, raised over British lines. A British officer was seen riding out toward the American trenches. The message was clear. Lord Cornwallis was ready to surrender. The morning of October 19th, 1781, was not loud. It was solemn. Thousands stood in silence along the road outside Yorktown. American militia, Continental regulars, French infantry, and local townspeople. They had waited years for this, watched comrades fall, endured betrayal, hunger, freezing winters, and battlefield chaos. Now, they watched a column of redcoats march out slowly, their weapons lowered, their flags furled. The British band played a tune some claimed was called "The World Turned Upside Down." It had. Behind the defeated column, General O'Hara rode in place of Cornwallis, who claimed to be ill. He tried to surrender to Rochambeau. The Frenchman refused. He pointed to Washington. Washington, in turn, deferred to General Benjamin Lincoln, the very man humiliated at Charleston when the British had once denied him the honor of surrender. Now, in poetic justice, Lincoln accepted the British sword. At Gloucester Point, news of the surrender arrived in the wind. Soldiers on both sides dropped their arms, some in disbelief, others in tears. The battle was over. The war, nearly. Simcoe and his men were allowed safe passage back across the river. He had lost more than just the fight. He had lost the initiative. His raid had been bold, but the world didn't reward boldness alone. Timing had betrayed him. The revolution had moved faster than he had. The Battle of the Hook had sealed the trap. Without Simcoe's cavalry to strike from the rear, Cornwallis was a cornered animal. Washington's siege could choke him slowly, methodically. The Hook wasn't just a place. It was the final tug that pulled British power off balance, until it fell. And in that moment, on that quiet October morning, the American dream stopped being a rebellion. It became a fact. The world would never be the same.